The Signavio Collaboration Hub is your sole source of truth, where employees across offices and borders can meet to combine their work and expertise with critical information available to all users in a single place, so that processes function smoothly and efficiently. In addition, you can upload any supporting materials you might need, from basic documents through to spreadsheets and image files. By allowing multiple participants to collaborate, Signavio Collaboration Hub helps you avoid cumbersome, time-consuming email chains or sifting through folders for the latest version of documents. Instead, responsibilities, roles, process hierarchies, and process steps can all be viewed at a glance. The Collaboration Hub is your personalized entry point to all Signavio content. You should see content that is most relevant to you. Now here in our demonstration, we're going to start with the dictionary. The dictionary is the central object management repository in Signavio. A dictionary entry represents an object that is relevant for one or more of your processes. It allows you to manage and reuse specific modeling elements. It also helps you make sure all of your models are using the same terms and the same elements in your organization-specific modeling environment. The dictionary is a crucial component to achieve a consistent and well-structured business objects management of your diagrams. By default, as you can see on the screen here, there are 8 categories of object that can be created in the dictionary. However, you can extend the dictionary to create ones of your own. In this case, we're just going to add a single document entry as an example. We will use this later when we're creating a process diagram. So here we can see some samples that have already been added. Now we're editing the dictionary, so let's create a new document. We're going to create a very simple one here, something to represent an invoice. So we can add a business description to this. Note we could also put in links. We can format this documentation as well. Let's create that. So we've created our invoice document inside the dictionary. We'll use that later on as part of our demonstration. If I now go back to the hub and refresh the page, you can see that that invoice is here along with a timestamp. Okay, now let's start to create a process flow. We could be doing this as part of a design process for implementing a new process in our organization, or we could be using it to create a benchmark against which we can compare our existing processes. Process models can be created in 2 different ways. They can be created through Quickmodel, or they can be created using the more advanced graphical designer. We'll be exploring both in this demonstration. Quickmodel allows fast process capturing and completion. It supports a table-based modeling approach where you can add information by filling in a table. The graphical diagram representation will automatically be created by the system, which enables you to fully concentrate on the diagram information. Let's start to create our process here. We'll just complete the form. So we're going to create a purchase to pay process here. We'll call, very simply, the start of the process start and the end of the process end. We can also add, again, documentation to this. So for example, we might want to add a description over here. Now at the bottom here is where we start to add our activities. Simply by using the plus button, we can start to type them in. So in this case, we have initially a create purchase order task, which is then followed by a send purchase order task, where we send the purchase order off to our supplier. Just get those in the right order. Then our third one is receive goods, where we can see our goods are then being delivered to our organization. Then we would presumably receive an invoice from that supplying organization. And then finally, at the end here, we would book that invoice into our purchasing system ready for payment. So obviously this is a perfect system where everything goes according to plan. As we'll see later on in the real world, there are obviously many different things that could happen with this particular flow, but we're just creating here our perfect process. Now we can start to associate with these activities various other elements from our dictionary. So for example, earlier we created our invoice. If I start to type that in here, it pops that up from the dictionary and we can see that's associated here. You'll also notice at the bottom of the screen here, it's starting to build that diagram automatically. We could also say who's responsible for these steps. So for example, in this case, the creation of the invoice and the sending of the invoice is something that's done by our procurement department, whereas here receiving the goods would be dealt with by our central purchasing department. And you can see at the bottom of the screen it's starting to add swim lanes to identify which parts of our organization are doing these particular parts of the process. Okay, so we can now save what we've done here. I mean, we could capture further insights of information or categories of information about our activities if we wished. Using this spanner icon here, you'll see there's a number of extra things we could do. But as I say, we're keeping it simple here and creating a very simple process. Okay, let's close that. Now, what we want to do is go and say, well, what if we wanted to do things in more depth though? What if we wanted to have access to a proper editing environment for our process flow diagram? So let's select Process Manager here from our menu, which will take us into that. And we can see here objects that have been created inside this environment. I'm going to use my purchase to play here, which is the model that we just created inside the Quickmodeler. So here you can see inside the Process Manager, this is where we can do further work on documenting, model and simulating business processes. We can include our colleagues in collaborative design across modeling, analyzing, optimizing, simulating and executing processes. And this share functionality, which we'll see more of, will instantly share modeling feedback, reviews and comments across the entire suite. Now in Process Manager, new BPMN diagrams are created in the Explorer. The Explorer is the entry and management point. You can manage folders and diagrams, etc. You can also edit your profile settings here and manage the administrative aspects of the workspace. Now we've used Quick Start to quickly document our process, but now we're going to use this Graphical Editor to add further detail to this design. Now in the editor you can edit, design and format diagrams. You can also perform checks on their conformance with industry and best practices. So in this case, we're going to start adding some detail into this. So for example, here if we look at Create Purchase Order, if we look on the right hand side, we can see there are a lot more details here about this. We can add more documentation about it, we can add colors, etc. What I'm going to do here, because one of the things we'd like to do is simulate how well this process is going to work, is just add a couple of details about it. So let's imagine we've done some time analysis and we've worked out the average time for creating a purchase order is about 5 minutes. We can also put in some costs. How much does it cost to execute this process? Let's put in €3 here. I'm just going to simply go through here and put in some times for each of my processes. I'll do them all with the same times and just vary some costs here. I say we'll be able to use these timings and these costs in a few minutes to accurately simulate what this process is going to look like in the real world and how many and what type of resources are we going to need to execute it. Okay, so we've added those details in there. One final thing we're going to add in here, you'll notice down the left hand side here we have a menu of various elements that can be added to our diagrams. So one of the things we'll see later on are some gateways where we're making decisions. Should this happen? Yes, no. Do we follow a different path through our process? But in this case, I'm just going to add in a simple IT system. We'll imagine, for example, that's our SAP system. You'll notice here it's pointing out, yep, there's no dictionary editing, no dictionary there available, so I'm creating a new one. I can use the plus button here though to decide RS4 system. So we could add in here to say, well, even while I'm creating the diagram, once again going back to that dictionary we were using, I can create items inside there. So let's create that as a system. And I'd like to associate here, say, okay, so we need 2 association lines. Drag those in like that, and then just grab the ends here. So let's imagine in this case, we'll add another one of those. Just to highlight here that the create purchase order and the booking of the invoice are things that happen within our SAP system. Okay, let's save what we've done. Now you'll notice here, we mentioned earlier that Signavio will automatically check the diagram here to say, are there any issues with the model that we've created? I can review those here down the bottom of the side here. So, there are some warnings here, no particular errors. Obviously I could go off and I could fix these particular issues if I wish. In this case, I'll just leave them as they are and I'll save it as it is. Notice here the diagram is being saved in the industry standard BPMN format, Business Process Model and Notation format, and these diagrams could then be exported to other tools, also imported from other tools as well. Okay, let's save this. Now if I go to the top right here and look at diagram comparison, obviously we've now created a second version of our diagram. We created the first one in the Quickmodeler and then the second one in the editor. This comparison tool allows us to see both of those side by side. So again, a very useful tool if you've got multiple people working on diagrams to be able to see what are the changes if one person's done something, as well as adding comments on those changes. We can visually review them here while we're reviewing that process. But what I'd really like to do here is now go off and run a simulation to see how this process might actually work in the real world. So here you can see the various steps of our flow diagram that we've created. And at the bottom here we can see scenarios. So already things like the costs have been picked up here, and those here. If I create, if I select the frequency here, we can start to change some of those things. So we can see the costs here that we put in earlier. We can see the durations that we put in. Here I've got frequency. How often does this process, how often do we think it's going to happen? So let's say, for example, that actually we think this is going to happen a frequency of 20 times rather than just the 4 that was there originally. And then I can save that scenario and we'll call that current. So we've modeled here, this is our current scenario. But what we also want to do is say, okay, and what happens in the future? What happens if the volume of purchase orders being raised starts to increase? So I can create a second scenario, which in this case we'll just call future, and I'll copy the current that we have, and I can go and change some things here. So for example, I might change the frequency and say, well, actually this is what happens if the volume doubles to 40 a day. So I can take that and save that scenario. Then at the top of the screen here, I can say, okay, let's simulate all of those multiple cases, those activities going through our flow. So I'll select play here. So at the moment, we'll look at current and we'll press play. And we can see all of those tasks going through. The numbers here at the side here are indicating how many tasks are going through. Obviously in total over the week there will be 100 activities, and we can see that by the end of the week we've processed 99 of these. So most of our activities have been able to be handled with the resources that we had available here. We also get an idea of what the costs of this might be. However, what about our future state where we're going to have 40 of these purchase orders happening every day? Do we have the capacity to deal with that? So I can go back here and press play. Here you can see we're getting an error message saying the simulation could not complete because we don't have enough capacity. The number of tasks going through has been blocked here at book invoice. There are over 100 cases now stuck over our week at the book invoice point. So in order to fix that problem, we will probably need to assign some more capacities, some more resources. So if we look here under future, we can see that that task represented by the blue dots here are the responsibility of the central purchasing department. So let's take them, and if we gave them, for example, another head, save that scenario there, we can then go back here and play it again. And then we can see in this case, we're now able to actually do, if I press restart, we're now actually able to process all of that work. You can see here, for example, now that at the end of the week, 198 of our 200 cases have been satisfactorily processed. So we now get a much better idea of what's going on. I can even animate this to make it possibly clearer to see. If I press the play button here, what you should start to see are the numbers changing here, so we can see the cases going through here. We could monitor them to see where any bottlenecks might be. You'll notice it pauses for a few seconds. It's doing it in an accelerated time, but we said we were doing 8-hour days here. So the pauses are actually the night going past before the next day starts, and then there we go. We can now see the numbers continuing there. So the animation tool there, again, really helps to visualize those cases going through the workflow. Okay, let's close our simulation and let's close our Explorer, and we'll go back to the hub. Now we've seen two different types of diagrams there. We've seen being able to create the simple workflow using the quick build, and then we've seen being able to edit that and simulate that inside the editor. However, there are, for some diagrams, for high level perspective on what's going on, we sometimes need a simpler diagram. So we can also create these value chain diagrams, see here. Now these are very simple to create, so we won't create one here in a demonstration, but we can see an example here. And value chain diagrams can provide a very intuitive overview of organizations' processes. Each element of the value chain diagram depicts a process or a process group or a specific organizational unit. So far we have concentrated on creating a process model from scratch. This may have been achieved by a process of talking to the business, interviewing users about their roles, etc. This would particularly be the case if we were designing a new process that had not yet been implemented. However, Signavio can also be used to document existing processes from active systems using a process called process mining. Here we will import a process log from an active system. So the first thing I'm going to do is upload some new process data. We're going to call this process purchase to pay. And I'm going to get some files from my desktop here. Now in this case, we're going to upload an audit file that's been extracted from our purchase to pay system. Now options exist to automate this process. However, here we're just going to use a CSV file. Now we now need to let Signavio know what the columns in our data represent, particularly a unique ID for each transaction, which will be this purchase order ID. We need to say what the activity was that was being done at that point, which is this column. And we need to let it know what is the date and timestamp when the activity took place. Also, we need to here tell it that we're happy with supplier and requested by being choices, which is kind of Signavio's way of saying they're dimensions of information. And then finally over on the right here we have the order value. We'll just let it know that rather than being a number, that is actually a currency. Okay, so now let's import that data. That will take a few seconds for Signavio to take the data in and look at all those activities and dates and times and work out what all of those changes were, when they happened, etc., all those steps in the process. Note up in the corner here there's a merge strategy option here, so obviously as we go through time we'll be importing more and more audit logs. Here we can decide how do we handle that. Do we replace the data coming in? Are we bringing in a whole new event log? Do we duplicate events, etc., etc.? Okay, that's turned to a tick now, so that we know that that data has now been successfully imported. Next thing we want to do is create an investigation on top of that data that we've imported so we can start to see what's going on. So we'll call this our purchase to pay investigation. But what we're also going to do is we want to start to compare this real world process that we've imported from our live system against the perfect modeled system that we created earlier. So I'm going to select here purchase to pay, and that will bring up, here's the shared document, the diagram that we already created. Now in order for it to successfully compare the two, we maybe have to do some mapping to let it know which of these roles in our, or which of these activities in our real system map on to what we called in our design system. You'll notice here, for example, when we created things earlier, we called it PO rather than purchase order. But in the live system, it's calling it purchase order. So we need to map them. So I can just simply drag those across, send purchase order to there, receive goods there, scan invoice here, and book invoice over here. Now, of course, these were just the 5 steps that we imported from our design system that we created from our perfect world view of how the process will go. But of course, when we look down the side here, we see there are a number of other processes that are happening in our real world system, and we'll be able to start exploring those. Let's finish the mapping of that there. Now we can start to add elements to our investigation. Now, an investigation is essentially a document split into chapters which allows interactive exploration of the real-world activity from the imported log. This is done via a number of widgets that can be used to highlight various aspects of the process data. So, for example, a process discovery widget has already been created. We'll start with that. Now, this process discovery widget generates a process model from the event log data, visualizing the most important behaviors in our process. Now we can see here the numbers in between here. These are the volumes of occurrences of cases going through each of these stages. If I click here to cycle time, we can see what's the average time taken to go between each of these process stages in our real world process service. Now, at the moment, we're viewing only 91% of our activities that view this perfect flow that go through just these 5 stages. However, if I turn activities up a bit, we can start to see that there are other activities that are going on. So, for example, here we can see that there are 55 cases here that go through our change price process or change price activity. So most of our activities have a purchase order going on to receiving goods, but in 55 cases, for whatever reason, the system has gone back on itself and the price has been changed on what the original purchase order was meant to be. Probably because some negotiations happened, or maybe the price of the goods that we were trying to purchase have dropped or changed. If I take the arrow up under sequence flows, we can also start to see that there are different routes that happen as well. So for example here, scanning invoices, 296 documents do that, but we can start to see here there's a line here that indicates that 22 of our activities didn't start at this end. They started at the scan invoice. And that's something we probably want to investigate. So the investigation we have here can be divided up in chapters. So let's create a new chapter here. We'll call it Purchase to Pay Details. And we've created that as a new chapter here. And we can start to add widgets to it. So let's create a simple one to start off with. Let's start with a value, which is just a simple single metric. So we'll call this average cycle time. The attribute that we want to look at here is cycle time, and what we want to do is give an average of that. We could be having a sum, min, max, average, etc. as well. So let's save that widget. So we can now see that the average time taken for cases to go through the whole of this cycle is 29 days and 3 hours. So, okay, that's interesting, but we'd really want to start to break that down. Now I can very quickly here just take that and ask it to break that down and give us a view over time. And immediately it's created another widget. In this case over day, but I can go in and edit this and say, well, actually, rather than doing it at a daily level, let's do it at a monthly level. Maybe make the data a little easier to understand. And we can see here that, around April, May time, there was a bit of a drop in the average cycle time, but recently that average time has started to creep up again. So again, that's something we might want to investigate further. We can also start to break that down by distribution, which enables us to see, okay, so how many cases are around, that average? And we can see that, most cases are dealt with between about, 18 and 35 days seems to be about the average time, but there are a few outliers. Some seem to get through it quite quickly. Some are taking quite a more longer amount of time. Okay. Let's create another widget. And we'll have a breakdown here. And what we want to see here is, okay, so let's start to get specific and see, maybe who is it that are raising these particular purchase orders. So we'll call this our requested by breakdown. The attribute that we're going to be looking at here is, again, the number of cases. We want to do a count of those cases. And we want to see, in this case, group it by who requested, who made these orders within our organization, which was part of the data that we brought in from the audit log. And let's see that as a horizontal chart. So we can now start to see all of the people who've been ordering things and how long they've taken. Now we can kind of funnel this out here and say, well, what we actually want to do here is look maybe at the top 10 of those, for example, something like that. And we can see here that there's one user at the top here. Let's get rid of a couple more. There we go, that's more like it. 10, like that. So we can now start to see, okay, so these are our top 10 requested buys, and we see who's been raising the most orders. That's not particularly a problem. We know that some people are going to be ordering more things than others. Okay, so now let's add another widget though. In this case, we're going to do something a little more complex. We're going to do a look at process conformance. So we're going to say, okay, let's compare this real world data that we've pulled in via our audit log and compare it to the perfect or designed process that we created at the beginning. So for each activity in this case, through the past, we can see the times here, which is the average amount of time taken to go through each of these processes. And if we look at the clock here, we can see here, what's the average cycle time going through here. However, what we're starting to see here is the results here are sorted by the average. So the cases that took the longest time, these ones that took 39 days to go through our process, there were 3 cases that took an average of that to do, we can start to investigate that. So here, for example, we can see those particular activities involved this extra step, this change price. And not only did they go through change price, we can see this little circular line here, which indicates that they went through change price several times. So during the life of creating these orders, for some reason they went off, the price was changed again, etc. And this was repeated several times. And that's what's led to the cycle times being particularly long for these three cases. So that's one thing we might want to look at is, what are the reasons for these prices being changed? So we could start to investigate that. What we also might want to look at here is the throughput. So let's use that and select a process funnel here. So that's created a throughput model for us here. So throughput gives us this blue line, which indicates what's the volume of cases going through each of the flows. Kind of like a Sankey diagram, which are a type of flow diagram in which the width of those arrows is proportional to the flow rate. Now again, I can use the control at the side here to show us more detail. So if I just start to see some extra sequence flows, we can start to see here where there were 22 cases here that started with scanning the invoice. Now that's very interesting because, of course, this indicates that some orders are being raised respectively after the invoice has arrived. So somebody somewhere is going directly to a supplier, making orders. When the invoice comes, then they're creating the purchase order. And this would probably be in violation of the company's policy. Okay, so we've really got something here we need to investigate. So let's add in here a variant explorer. We'll call it variant explorer. Now we can see here our cases going through here. So this at the moment is highlighting our top 3 flows of information, or flows through the process by volume of cases. We could also look at these by time, or we could also look at these by the value of those flows. So I can see here, for example, the most populous, or the most likely route that our orders have been taken, and 169 of them did, represent 2.2 million. But if we unselect these and just look at this third group here, we can see here that 339K's worth of orders all started with this scan invoice. So we may have a significant problem here, where over 300,000 in currency of our orders have started with scanning the invoice. Let's turn these back on again. Notice one interesting thing here, we do have the option here to animate these as well. So if I press the little button here next to that, I can see, again, I can see the line going up here from scan invoice up and down through this. So again, animation. Obviously this is a simple diagram, but with more complex flows, those animations really help to bring it to life and understand exactly how the data is flowing, or how the activities are flowing through the process. Okay, so we'll deselect those 2 variants and just take that third one, as that's the one that we're interested in. Now we can apply that selection as a filter to the whole of the chapter that we're looking at the moment. So now we can really start to investigate. So we can see those are those 22 cases there going through. But if I scroll up to the top here, where we look at our requested by variants, we can now start to see of those orders that started with a invoice being scanned rather than a purchase order being raised. We can see there are a couple of people at the top here who've been doing this a lot, but the process does seem to be slightly endemic in that there are a number of other people who've done it 1 or 2 times. So we've really now got down to the root of this particular problem, and this was then something we may want to take action on outside of the tool. If I scroll to the top here, you can see that process has been, that filter is in place. You can see how many cases it covers, 22 or 7% of the cases that have gone through our system and that we retrieved the audit log for. Let's remove that filter. Okay, so let's scroll back down here to our Variant Explorer. One thing you may have seen as we're looking here, there's a button here called Generate BPMN. So that gives us the ability to take the real world process that we've imported and now go and build a BPMN model of what's happening in the real world. And we can say we want to do that with all of our cases or a subset of them. In this case, let's just take the top 8, and then I'll take this Generate BPMN option. And what it's doing now is it's built me a process flow diagram that represents our real world process that we imported from the from our system using the audit log. And you notice this diagram is now more complex. We've got a number of these decision points where things can go one way or another. So we now start to see maybe what our real world process looks like. And elements that we're seeing here can be incorporated back into our data dictionary. So for example, if we decided, yep, change prices is a valid thing, it happens, we're negotiating lower prices, that's good. So we'd want to include change price as one of the objects in a dictionary and reuse it elsewhere. I can simply put that there. I can document it, and I've now created a new element in the data dictionary called change price that I could then use later on. Okay, let's save this new diagram that we've created. We'll call it our real world P2P process. And I can now close that diagram. Let's close our investigation and return to the hub. So designing and updating process information is likely to be a task done by many people across the organization, both in IT and in the business. Having a shared environment that allows for collaboration while still maintaining rights regarding who can do what to which objects is key. So to use that, we will use a simple workflow of approval of the process diagram and investigation that we've just created. So I'll go in here into the Workflow Accelerator and we'll select Processes. So we already have here a simple approval process for approving the diagram and content that we've just created. It enables me to take it. You notice here it goes through some formal approval. It also then goes off to a business user to approve it as well before the state is set to approved, and we're able to then share the content that we've created with other users via the hub. Okay, now let's go into the Process Manager. Here we can see our shared documents, which include the purchase to pay process that we created earlier. We're going to select that, I'm going to share that, and I'm going to start an approval workflow based on that. Now that started that approval off. If I follow the link here, if you recall, the first stage in that process was for me as the author and creator to say, yes, I approve this and want it to be moved on to the next stage. And you can see that is now there in my cases waiting to be approved. So I can go into formal approval here and I can approve it. Now in the real world, this would then go off to someone in the business, for example, so a business sponsor who is responsible for saying, you know, have what we documented here match what they're anticipating in the real world. In this case, it's a demonstration, so I've set it up so that I am both the creator and the business approval user as well. Now I can go in here, I can add some comments in here. So for example, I can go and look at the diagram. And you notice here I've got the same things we created earlier on. I could add some comments on that. So, you know, shouldn't this be purchase order rather than PO, for example. So I could submit that as a comment here against that diagram. I can also say add comments against the workflow of this as I approve it. And there we go, that process has now been approved. If I close down my Task Explorer here, if I just look at the page I've got here, maybe just quickly refresh that, we can see here that our purchase to pay here now has a green tick against it. That indicates that this has now been approved, ready for publication by my business user. So I can now take my purchase to pay, I can share it, and I will publish that to the Collaboration Hub. And effectively, I'm now making this public for other users to see. So we'll take the purchase to pay and we'll publish that. And the little world icon now appears to show that that has now been published. If I close down these couple of tags and go back to our hub, if we now go and take a look in our processes, we can see that our purchase to pay diagram has now been published into our open portfolio. It means users across the organization who have the correct permissions could see that. I can open that up here. I can see there's been one comment made against that. Obviously that's the one that I created earlier on. I can also say, well, obviously as I created this, I want to track what happens to this process that I've created. So if I press the starred icon here, what that does is basically saying, this is a favorite of mine, this is something I want to track, I want to be informed when there are updates, when there are comments against this process that I've created. And if I now go back here to the home, you can see that my purchase to pay here is under recently visited and under starred as well. Finally, there's something here called the news feed. And if I take a look at that, you can see then I will see what's happening inside the system. So anything that I've starred will be highlighted, such as my purchase to pay, which was published a minute ago. And if we look at them all, we can see here all of the activities that have been going on inside the system, when things have been updated, created, etc. Elements of workflow here as well from previous things. But we can see what we've done in our demonstration today. So in summary, we've seen how we can use Signavio to create process diagrams from scratch. We've imported log data and created investigations which have allowed us to identify root causes of issues with our real-world processes and compare them to our intended process flow. Everything we've done has been captured in the dictionary, which encourages reuse and collaboration. And then to extend collaboration, we've used a workflow to authorize the publishing of content into the hub, our central point for all of the activities that Signavio offers. Thanks for watching this demonstration.